Welcome to the Healthy Food, Healthy Farms webinar series. Today's webinar is Farm Subsidies equal high fructose corn syrup equal obesity, or do they? I'm Kendra Cuthbertson with Healthy Food Action and the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, or IATP. Healthy Food Action is a nationwide effort to engage health professionals in food and agriculture policy issues critical to creating a healthier food system. Today's webinar is presented in cooperation with Food and Water Watch, Public Health Institute, and the Healthy Farms, Healthy People Coalition. We will be taking questions today from the audience members after our panelists have finished their presentations. You can submit your questions at any time during the webinar by using the question panel on your screen. Just type in your question and hit send. We will review questions as they come in, and the panelists will respond to as many questions as time allows. Today we are joined by David Wallinga, Patty Lovera, Matthew Marsom, and Ben Lilliston. Now I'd like to pass it over to Dr. David Wallinga, who will serve as today's moderator and our first presenter.
Well, hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm David Wallinga. I'm with the Food and Health Program of IATP. And I wanted to just spend a few minutes describing our partners in today's webinar, the Healthy Farms, Healthy People Coalition. As you can see, the steering committee of that coalition involves IATP as well as Public Health Institute, Public Health Law and Policy, Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg School of Public Health, California Food and Justice Coalition, and American Farmland Trust. And these 6 groups began talking with each other about 14 months ago, and we have subsequently had a couple of meetings together, including a summit meeting last May in Washington, D.C. And as of about a week ago, or 2 weeks ago, we've launched publicly and are soliciting other organizations interested in joining with the coalition. You can find more information on Twitter, Facebook, and the World Wide Web at these addresses. So before we launch into our speakers, I want to just reflect on where we're at a number of different levels. First of all, because we're going to be talking about the Farm Bill, I wanted to throw out this quote from an article that appeared in The Hill, which is a publication to people in Capitol Hill from yesterday. And it pointed out that all big legislation is written behind closed doors, but they are doing this, meaning Farm Bill 2012, in such a compressed way, said one longtime lobbyist, that I'm having trouble finding out what's going on. And I dare say that for many health professionals and other members of the public, if the ag lobbyists are having a hard time finding out what's going on, then that probably goes doubly so for the rest of us. We're going to hear a little bit more about the details of the Farm Bill from our other speakers. Where we're at in terms of public health is important too. I think I'm going to talk about a number of different things. First of all, there's no dispute that we're at a very critical point, and a dangerous point, I think, in terms of obesity and overweight in this country, with about 2/3 of the adults and 1/3 of the children being overweight or obese, and with that prevalence doubling over the last 25 years or so. And this carries with it a lot of other chronic diseases. So 40% of U.S. adults now are pre-diabetes or have diabetes. And again, this is doubling over the span of a couple of decades. And of course, this is going to lead among the children that are becoming adults and who are overweight or obese to a lot more sickness and death from diabetes. And then just metabolic syndrome is another serious side effect, if you will. which in adults will increase cardiovascular disease risk by about 15-fold. So this is not a minor problem. You see the prevalence here in the adult population. Where we're at in terms of just calorie consumption is important too. And Putnam et al., which is a USDA publication, several years ago pointed out that at some level the obesity problem is pretty simple. We're eating more calories than we used to, and we're also not increasing our physical activity to compensate. And so at that point in 2002, they estimated that the calorie excess from 1985 to 2000 was about 300 extra calories per person per day, and that seemed to be driving problems with obesity. But they actually updated this data a couple of years ago. We're going to see the updated figures later, but how do those 300 calories a day extra split out? Well, they found that about a quarter of them were from added sweeteners in the average person's diet, about another quarter in terms of added fats, and the bulk of the rest in terms of mostly refined grains. But if you take into account updated data, instead of 300 extra calories, it's more like 600 extra calories between 1970 and 2007. So this is really quite significant. Another thing to think about, though, is that these calories have not increased uniformly across different kinds of food product groups. I'm getting a lot of static in the line, Kendra. I don't know if you can address that. But so in fact, if you just look at corn starches, the average calorie intake's gone up at about 190%. Added sugar is up about 14% over that time period. The corn sweetener is about more like 300%. Similarly, added fats and oils have gone up a bit. But if you split out salad and cooking oils, some 80% of which are soybean derived, it's much higher number. And so where we're at in terms of the food environment is that regardless of what has led to this, we've got very abundant supplies in the broader environment of processed foods, foods that are high in added sugars and fats, not terribly healthy foods. And in fact, folks like Adam Drunowski, nutritional economist, has pointed out that there's this imbalance in the food environment such that these calorie-dense, nutrient-poor, highly processed foods, in fact, are those that can be seen as most affordable, most accessible, and most inflation-resistant. And what do I mean by inflation-resistant? We put together this graphic for our Food Without Thought report several years ago, but this is just USDA data that's adjusted for inflation. And in fact, what it shows in a pretty simple way is that over time, some of the foods on the right with added fats and sugars have actually decreased in price, while some of the healthier foods like fruits and vegetables have increased in real prices. And then finally, I just want to wrap up and say that our farm environments are fairly imbalanced too. We just about 80% or more of the arable crop acreage is devoted to just 3 crops: corn, soybeans, and wheat. And the balance is other sorts of things. And this leads to a very homogeneous looking farm sector. And so we're going to see a little bit later what's happened with soybean acreage, but it looks much like this, with a steady increase over the last 20 years, but even going back farther than that in corn acreage as well as soybean acreage. And what we don't see is an equivalent increase in fruit and vegetable production. So here's actually some data from Mike Ham at Michigan State showing that the shortfall, there's a shortfall compared to what we know is needed for a healthy diet in terms of what Americans are eating, probably even worse for kids than adults. And this is true whether you're looking at fruits or legumes or dark green vegetables or orange vegetables. And so right now, U.S. farmers aren't producing enough fruits and vegetables to feed the population at the levels that we would like them to consume. But if we increased consumption levels, then the shortfall of U.S. farmers growing these things would be even more pronounced. So let me just finish up there, and let's hear from our other speakers who I'm going to introduce now. First is Patty Lovera, the Assistant Director of Food and Water Watch, who also coordinates their food team. Patty has a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Lehigh University and a master's in environmental policy from the University of Michigan. Previously, she was a deputy director at Public Citizen and a researcher with the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice. Next, we'll hear from Matthew Marson of the Public Health Institute, where he was the first director of public health policy and advocacy. Matthew's bachelor's degree is from the University of Stirling in Scotland, where he also has postgraduate certificates in Russian and research methods. Previously, he was chief of policy, partnerships, and planning of the Cancer Prevention and Nutrition section of the California Department of Public Health. He's still in California now. And thirdly, Ben Lilliston, my colleague at the Institute for Ag and Trade Policy, is our Vice President for Programs. And when he previously was our Communications Director, Ben was either the researcher, the writer, or the editor for much of IATP's work around the Farm Bill or related food policies for most of the last decade. And he's also authored other books, including one on genetically engineered foods. And without further ado, I'm going to ask Kendra to pass the baton over to Patty Lovera. Patty?
Okay, I'm getting my screen organized here, and we'll be ready to go. So this is Patty Lovera from Food and Water Watch, and it's great to be able to talk to a bunch of folks about this topic. It's very timely, as David mentioned, and pretty important, and it's great to talk to an audience that's thinking about public health and these issues. So Food and Water Watch has been looking at food issues for a long time. We're kind of considered a consumer group, so we start at the food end of things, but we think that we can't isolate the policy conversation to just food itself. We think we really have to look at the whole agriculture system that's delivering food to consumers. And one of the biggest, most, I think, widespread, commonly assumed things that people are starting to really kind of base their thinking about food policy on is the relationship between our Farm Bill, which sets up programs that USDA runs, including subsidies to farms, and the relationship that has to what we're eating. And we've seen, we just saw the compelling summary from David about what that means for health. We know we have a problem. We know we have an obesity problem, and it is tied to what we're producing and what we're eating. So the question is there an easy fix of, if you cut these subsidies, will obesity go down? And that's starting to become a pretty prominent part of the debate and the policy discussion, and that's what we wanted to tackle with a paper that Food and Water Watch and the Public Health Institute released a few weeks ago, talking about, are these assumptions and about farm subsidies and obesity, are they as easy as we're all assuming, and is it as easy to disconnect them and fix the obesity problem? And unfortunately, we think that it's not, that it's more complicated. So what we're dealing with, and the starting point a lot of folks are using when they enter a conversation about this, is that we have cheap corn and soybeans because of our farm policy that leads to high fructose corn syrup, soybean oil, corn and soy being fed to confined livestock and industrialized factory farm operations, which gives us cheaper meat, and that all of those things are part of a diet that drives obesity. So the next step in that thinking is if you take away the subsidies, if you just make this radical change to our farm policy, you take away these subsidies that are supposedly driving all of this, that's the easiest, most direct way to tackle obesity, because the price of junk food would go up. And so that's what we tried to really tackle in this paper, and really look at the connection and see if it is that direct of a link. And so there's kind of three themes that emerge from that, and then Matthew's going to talk a little bit about what we think the next policy steps should be based on what we found in this paper. So the first theme is, unfortunately, that it's just not that simple. And the first slide that I put up with this policy timeline isn't meant for people to worry about every farm bill since the 30s and worry about the details, but just to show that this didn't happen overnight, and that we have had changes in our farm policy that are tied into all of this, and they're more complicated and more elaborate than just the current programs that we refer to as subsidies. And the one piece that runs through all of this and runs through agriculture in modern times is the concept that farmers left to their own devices will overproduce because it makes sense for them as individuals. So we've always had a problem of farmers overproducing, especially these commodity crops like corn, soybeans, grains, the things that you can store for a long time until you're ready to sell them. And that's just been a fact of agriculture for a long time. And we've had that before we had the subsidies that we're currently talking about, which were really created in the mid-90s, towards the end of this timeline that I'm showing. A lot of people talk about the treadmill of production for farmers. So as everybody decides what to do as individuals, they produce a lot. And everybody produces a lot, the price goes down, and the price goes down, and they're getting less per acre and less per bushel, so they better produce more to make some money, and the cycle gets worse, so the treadmill speeds up. And so subsidies, as we know them, were invented really in the later part of this timeline to try to deal with some of the political fallout of farmers not making any money from what they do, and the subsidies came after the problem of overproduction, not first. So that's really kind of the first takeaway we've got in this paper that we worked on. And then the second point is that ending subsidies doesn't necessarily end overproduction. There's not that automatic result of ending subsidies because we've done this before. So in the 1996 Farm Bill, the programs that everybody pointed to as, oh, that's why we have overproduction, were for the most part ended. We ended some of them in the 80s, and then we really threw the last piece of it away in the mid-90s in 1996. And on this graph that shows soybean acreage and then the prices, so the green line is how much we're planting, the orange line is what farmers are being paid for it. You can see that in the mid-90s, we started to see more acres get planted. So after they ended the subsidies, we still saw more production of these crops. And there were pretty dramatic changes in what farmers were seeing after that Farm Bill, where from 96 into the mid-2000s, the supply of corn went up pretty dramatically by 28%, and the price of corn dropped by 32% because there was more of it. And that was after we took away these subsidies in 1996 that were supposedly driving the overproduction. And the pieces that used to prevent farmers from overproducing, there were several pieces of a farm safety net. That was kind of how it was referred to collectively, included things like a grain reserve that would, if there was too much of a crop, you would get them off the market to try to absorb the excess so you wouldn't have low prices. People wouldn't be driven to overproduce more. There was some supply management to try to convince people to grow less in the first place, but that takes coordination and policy. And then there was the concept of the price will not sink below a certain point. It was called a price floor, and it would just try to convince people if it won't sink below this price, you don't need to plant so much of it. So there was a combination of things to try to deal with this inherent problem in agriculture of overproduction of these crops. And so all of this really ties into, we think, what farmers are able to make when they are growing these crops. So the subsidy programs are a political solution, almost a political band-aid to stop the bleeding when the market is not paying prices to farmers that they can afford. So what we looked at in the paper and what this graph is showing is that while the gross income of what farmers are making has been going up over time, what they actually make, their net income, has not. And that's with the last decade of the dreaded subsidies, mostly direct payments that have been going to farmers that were supposedly making them rich. It isn't really, when you take into account their expenses and their costs, they're not really ending up making that much money, and that further drives them into this treadmill to grow more. And one of the reasons they're not necessarily switching out of this cycle of corn and soybeans and grains and growing healthier foods is that farmers grow what they can sell. And in most parts of the country, especially in the Midwest, corn and soybeans and grains are what they can sell. They're not set up to grow vegetables. They don't have markets for vegetables, and it's not like you flip a switch and they suddenly start growing the healthy foods we need to be eating more of. And one of the reasons they can only sell these crops is that we have a marketplace that is pretty distorted in terms of who is buying the food. So the slide that I just switched to talks about the market control by just a handful of companies in most sectors. We didn't put the grain buyers on. We ran out of room, but in every sector of agriculture, including ones we're not showing here, 4 companies control the majority of the market, and chances are in your local market, the farmer, you don't even have 4 choices, you have less. So that determines what price you get, what your options are, whether you can innovate or not. I mean, these are not folks who are able to make decisions that, you know, today I'm going to grow corn that becomes corn syrup because I want to. They grow corn that becomes corn syrup because that's what they're set up to do, and that's what they can sell in their area. And just taking away subsidies makes their prices more volatile and makes their life harder in some years, but it doesn't get them to switch to carrots. And so finally, the last piece we really wanted to put up here as a takeaway message and a bit of data from this slide is just that there's a lot more going on in food pricing than just what the farmer is getting paid for their crop. And so over time, since the 50s into, we have up to 2005, but the trend has continued to go down in the last couple of years. What the piece of a food dollar that a consumer spends that goes to the farmer continues to drop, we think in large part because of that consolidation we were showing on the last slide. So while the overproduction of these crops that make corn cheap and make soybeans cheap, while that has saved food processors money, and there is some data about that for, you know, those feeding livestock or those using corn syrup, there's so little of that in the final cost of some foods, especially foods like soda, that just making that raw material more expensive is not going to drive the price up of that food proportionally to make it out of reach of consumers. There's so many other prices, so many other factors in the price of that food besides just the cost of the corn. So there's just all of these, you know, factors happening in agriculture and in farm policy, and it's just the concept that we keep hearing a lot about. If you just end the subsidies, which most people, when they're talking about that, are talking about direct payments to farmers, which are relatively new in the scheme of our farm policy. If you just end those direct payments, farmers will magically stop overproducing these commodity crops or switch to something healthier. That it's more complicated than that, and we need a more sophisticated approach that has a lot of different parts that work together to prevent that overproduction. So I'm just going to cover the first one of these solutions, and then Matthew Marsden from the Public Health Institute is going to pick up the rest. So this is the very abbreviated version of what we think some of those policy solutions are. But the first one is really tackling this issue of overproduction in a more meaningful way. And honestly, a lot of it is replacing policies that have been lost. So the first is to establish something called a grain reserve, which is what it sounds like when there's too much of a crop. When we have a great year and everybody has a bumper crop, that's really bad for prices, and it's really bad for farmers in a perverse way. So when you have too much, you put some in a reserve. The government can run these reserves. They have in the past, and it helps make sure that the prices don't dip so dramatically low that farmers can't survive it. And then on the flip side of that, when you have a bad year and prices are going to be very, very high for the buyers of these crops, you can release them to try to ease the top of that peak, as well as taking the bottom off the valleys, because volatility is incredibly hard for farmers to survive. That's something we used to have in our commodity policies in our farm bill, and it was taken away, and it's really added to this treadmill of overproduction. Another piece of it is supply management, which is kind of farm policy speak for talking about how much we need to produce and the government is in the best position to do that and to figure out ways to get farmers to take some acreage out of production, whether it's because the land is vulnerable or just because we just don't need that much crop and it's better for everybody if they didn't plant there. That takes coordination, and that's the kind of thing we used to do through the Farm Bill and we stopped doing. And then the final piece, there's other pieces you can do as well, but a final piece that's missing and that we think needs to be back in the mix is the concept of a minimum wage or a minimum price for these crops, which if there was some assurance that you would get paid at least this, it would take some of the fear out of the equation that drives people to plant every inch of their farms that they can and overproduce and keep producing the cheap corn and soy. So all of those things are things that used to be in our farm policy that have been taken away, and instead what we have now is a form of subsidies, direct payments and other things that kind of try to stop the bleeding when there's a bad year and prices collapse. So that's the kind of more comprehensive package to we want to tackle for commodity policy, as opposed to just saying end the subsidies and that will magically turn things around. So Matthew, I'll hand it over to you to talk about the other recommendations.
Yeah, thank you, Patty. And I wanted to thank Patty and the partnership we've had with Food and Water Watch in putting together this white paper and an issue brief, and it is available online at the Food and Water Watch website. And I also wanted to thank Institute for Agriculture Trade Policy for pulling together this forum and the opportunity to talk about these issues. And it's truly valuable. I'm gonna focus very quickly on some of the other policy solutions. I do encourage everyone to download and to review the white paper and issue brief in detail. But in addition to the items that Patty mentioned, the second on our list is that truly we need to have a concerted policy effort to increase demand and access to healthy food. And that is at several levels. The first is, and these directly relate to the conversation taking place in Washington on the Farm Bill, we need to protect and strengthen the existing USDA food assistance programs that truly are providing the resources for underserved communities to access, or to get the resources to purchase healthy food. So that includes protecting the eligibility, benefit levels, and integrity of SNAP, and also protecting the Women, Infants, and Children Supplemental Nutrition Program, or WIC. And so that really for us is a first priority on increasing the, helping to increase the demand for healthy food. But other policy measures include providing support for its SNAP incentives, whether at the grocery store, but also at healthy and fresh food vendors such as farmers markets and places like that. That's truly critical. Expanding the availability of EBT, or electronic benefit transfer, at farmers markets and other community venues can really help to ensure that consumers, low-income SNAP consumers, can purchase fruits and vegetables at farmers markets and other venues. Fully funding the National Healthy Food Financing Initiative to encourage the development of new markets in underserved low-income communities. And I know there's been some real success in small pilots across the country, but we truly need a national, fully funded initiative, and that's one we strongly support. Expanding the National Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Snack Program in schools, and also helping to protect and strengthen programs like SNAP-Ed that are helping to promote healthy eating, and also, of course, active living, but promote increased access to healthy food, and so promoting health outcomes in underserved communities through that program. Thirdly, of course, is expanding the supply of healthy foods, and there are a number of ways that we can actually help farmers to diversify production and supply in local and regional markets, rather than simply shipping everything to large commodity producers. And there are several solutions we recommend, including for supporting research, training, and extension programs, helping the farmers to diversify their production, as well as providing a financial infrastructure to provide the safety net while we develop the farm and market systems will be necessary so that the changes are distributed equitably, not just to the largest corporate operations. And then finally, it's truly essential that we build those links between farmers and consumers to deliver healthy foods. And there's a number of ways that in the report we describe this, but just ensuring that a supply of healthy foods meets the national demand and support new and local regional markets for growers. And this could include smaller scale processing, cold storage, distribution, and retailing mechanisms that bring food from farmers to urban and rural consumers. And we recommend small business grant and loan programs, business development training, and other incentives to facilitate the infrastructure development. Overall, the overarching message is that there are groups that are benefiting from the current overproduction of commodity crops like corn and soybeans, and that's the giant corporations and the food fat cats, as they're called, that are using these crops to make the highly processed foods and feed animals on factory farms. And if we want to encourage healthy eating, we want to increase fruit and vegetable consumption, we have to stop being distracted by some outdated arguments that we think will be quick fixes, and instead do the hard work of making sure that markets for crops are functioning in a way that ensures a fair price for farmers and fair competition, and really does support alternative markets for healthy food. The report talks about, for example, recommendations to enforce antitrust and competition policies to ensure that all types and sizes of farms and food processors can access farm markets, to keep overproduction in check with programs like grain reserve and land set-asides, and truly to expand the supply of healthy foods by helping farmers diversify their production and supply local and regional markets. What we're trying to do by starting this conversation, before I hand back over to Ben with IATP, is that unfortunately there is a wedge being driven between the family farm community and other policy reform advocates, including some within the health community, that actually weakens and undermines our relationship. And what we really need to do is to come around a set of core policy recommendations that can develop long-term sustainable partnerships between our communities, so we can truly work to seek policy changes to rebuild the healthy food system. Our white paper, working with Food and Water Watch and the PHI, we've tried to move beyond the current debate and initiate a more informed and open debate about how comprehensive commodity policy reform and really reinstituting the common sense regulations that were in place prior to the deregulation can address diet-related public health problems and help to foster a sustainable food and agriculture system. And so with that, I'd like to hand back over to Ben.
Great, thanks very much, Matthew. I'm sure there's a lot of questions here, so I'm going to go fairly quickly through, and I only have a couple slides. And I'm going to build on the recommendations that both Patty and Matthew laid out. And one of the key points was looking at updating a supply management type of policy as opposed to a subsidy policy. And this is exactly what the National Farmers Union, one of the largest farmer organizations in the country, is proposing. And they recently published a study out of the University of Tennessee. They have an Agriculture Policy Analysis Center, and this is by Dr. Darrell Ray there, their lead economist. And what they did was they looked back, I think beginning in 1998 to 2008, and examined what would have been the cost, the taxpayer cost, if we had had a supply management system. And here they call it a farmer-owned reserve policy, so that's the red line there, as opposed to the current system, and that's the historic baseline. So you can see that not only does this approach to commodity programs have some benefits for farmers and have some benefits for consumers, but it also has significant benefits for taxpayers. And we feel like this is one of the real casualties of the secret Farm Bill process that's taking place right now, where ideas like this that actually could save money in these sort of budget-obsessed times don't get a fair hearing and aren't really on the table. And so we don't really know what's going to happen in the Farm Bill. There may be other opportunities to raise this proposal in the future, and certainly the National Farmers Union and IATP and Food and Water Watch and others will be looking for those opportunities. So that's one slide. The second slide is just a new bill that has been introduced that I think is a really good example of how we could rethink farm policy, particularly if we had significant government savings that you might have from a supply management program, how you could reinvest that. And this bill was introduced over the last several weeks by Shelley Pingree from Maine in the House and Sherrod Brown from Ohio in the Senate. And it's called the Local Farms, Food, and Jobs Act. But what's really unique about it is that right now the way the Farm Bill is constructed is there are 15 different titles, and each title is considered separately. They look at commodities, and they look at insurance, and they look at conservation, and they look at food stamps, all separately. So each has its interest group, and they all kind of fight to try to get how much money they can get for their particular title. This bill is different in that it crosses 9 different titles. It basically is acknowledging, hey, we have a system here, that these things interrelate between the farm, between processing facilities or the infrastructure to the consumer. And so really to reach the kind of goals we want, we need to take a systems-based approach and look across titles and affect each one. So the way it does it is it targets consumer, well, we have a different order here, but it targets farmers. One of the big challenges for farmers who are want to grow different types of crops, fruits and vegetables, or target local markets and provide fresh food is access to credit. And bankers and financiers don't quite know how to handle farms of that size and growing different crops. And it's also a challenge for insurance. This is really critical for farmers. They need to be covered in sort of weather catastrophes and those sort of things. And right now they're really at a supreme disadvantage. So this bill sort of helps farmers who want to target local markets. It goes into the middle of the chain and looks at these better healthy foods infrastructure. So that's loan funds for processing facilities, marketing and promotion. So the middle part of the food chain, and then of course it goes towards the consumers and has additional approaches to increase food stamp usage at farmers markets, give schools and other institutions and government procurement policies where they have more flexibility to purchase from local farmers. So we just kind of point to this as an example of really how we should be thinking about farm policy. And again, this is another potential casualty of the secret farm bill process that's taking place, is that, you know, it's a concern that a lot of these ideas, that this bill won't be considered on its own, and that some of these ideas will lose their way in the super committee as they consider the farm bill. So I'm gonna leave it at that and pass it over to David. And here's put up on the screen an action alert that Healthy Food Action is doing around that particular bill. So if you're interested in supporting it, you can go to healthyfoodaction.org. And I'll pass it on to David if you want to take questions.
Well, thank you. I think we've got at least 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more for questions. I think our panelists have agreed to stay a little after the hour since we have so many folks online. But the first question is for Patty Lovera. And the question is, on the average farm income slide, could you please describe what the average farm looks like? Were certain farm scales excluded?
Okay. Yes, so this is Patty. So when we were looking at this, we were using USDA data, and they have a lot of different ways that they'll look at farms. What we were using to look at this, and this is probably the most significant thing that would change who was included or not included, was folks that were on a family-owned farm that were doing full-time farming, and so that does take some of the smallest enterprises out of there. But we were calling average a farm that could support a full-time farmer, not something that's being done on a part-time basis.
Right. And I think several presenters will probably want to answer this one. As we begin advocating for these important shifts to support fruit and vegetable production, which is labor intensive, as well as regional production networks, including both small and mid-sized farms, what efforts are being made to include discussions of a fair wage for farm workers in the dialogue among public health professionals?
I'll take the first one of that. This is Matthew at PHI. I'll say that it's certainly a priority for the Healthy Farms, Healthy People Coalition to work with the farm worker organizations and also food chain workers broadly. And I know, David, you've certainly been a strong proponent of this, that we truly do engage them as stakeholders to urge that that the food system is one that supports outcomes that are equitable and have justice at the center of them for all sectors of the food system, from the consumer through to the farmer and, of course, food workers in between. So I just think it's something that's critical, and they need to be both at the table as we're working on these policy solutions and engaged in shaping the outcomes as well. So I think that's a critical point that certainly is central to our decision making.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew, and I would agree. I would say that for some of us at least, and IATP has a food justice project as well. It's inherent in how we see a healthy farm bill as being one that's also addresses issues of fairness. And so in the meetings we've had that I mentioned at the very beginning with the Healthy Farms, Healthy People Coalition, one of the partners in those meetings has been the Rural Coalition. And in part, their members include many of the farmers from communities of color that have often been excluded from previous farm bills. And so it would be, at least from our perspective, good to make sure that going forward in the farm bill that doesn't continue to happen.
And the other groups, I think, have been the Food Chain Worker Alliance and Coalition of Immokalee Workers and others that we've been engaging with, and we can provide contacts, obviously, to those organizations if people are interested.
Correct. This one, I think, again, several people could address it. How do you expect people to demand healthy food? The president was not even able to pass legislation to improve school lunches. It's just something that came out in the last day or two. If we cannot demand healthy foods for school kids, that's not a good sign. I think that's, so the question is, how do we expect people to demand healthy foods?
I can take a shot at that if you want. This is Patty. It's a great question. It's incredibly current. I mean, there's lots of shenanigans going on in Washington right now, whether it's through the secret farm bill or in the budget process, which has done some damage this week on things like healthy school lunches. So this, I think, is an indicator of why, in addition to demanding things as consumers, there's a lot of talk about voting with our dollars, and we support that, and that's hugely important. It also shows that we also have to be building enough political power that we can prevent things like that from happening, and we can't yet. We've learned that lesson the hard way in a few things recently. So we need to be telling people to act as educated consumers and building the demand locally and helping rebuild local food systems with their food dollars. That is hugely important, but their job doesn't stop there. We also have to do it as citizens and demand the same things from our policymakers and our regulators and all these other systems, and we have a ways to go there. So I think that's part of the education piece that we have to do, that shopping well isn't enough. We have to also hold our government accountable on these topics.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, I think, so as people, I think, are aware, what happened yesterday with the conference report from the Ag Appropriations is as a direct result of lobbying by certain industry groups, including ConAgra and Swanson, I believe, that as a result of that, in the conference report, a slice of pizza would now qualify as a vegetable in the school lunch program. And that, I think, for many of us harkens back to the policy under the Reagan administration when ketchup was considered a vegetable. It truly is ludicrous. And I think it is a setback. It's something that we need to be organized around. As Patty said, we need to recognize where we need to be focusing our efforts. I think in terms of how do we demand people or expect people to demand healthy foods, we are strong supporters, as I mentioned earlier, of reforming the SNAP nutrition education program, that the changes that went through in the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. I think as part of that effort, we need to be truly looking at policy and environmental change in communities so that community residents, neighborhoods do support a healthy diet, that the healthy choice is an easy choice. Currently, we're all familiar with statistics on that many communities simply do not have access to healthy food, that in order to make that healthy choice, it is difficult, if not impossible, in many communities. And we need a concerted effort between the farming community, public health, and others to advocate for those changes at a community level, to support those environmental policy change to make the healthy choice almost, just not just the easy choice, the choice of common sense and simple ease.
This is a good follow-up question. I think maybe Ben first. Fruit and vegetable prices have grown in the last several years relative to prices for sweets, sodas, and baked goods. This suggests that a problem more with supply, I think supply of fruits and vegetables, than with demand. I guess the first question would be, do we agree with that assertion? But then the second question is, will demand-focused approaches run the risk of more money chasing after the same supply of fruits and vegetables? In other words, how do we ensure that the fruit and vegetable supply grows enough to meet the demand and stays affordable? Ben or Patty, do you want to take a stab at that?
I can start. Yeah, this is a really good question and a really difficult one, I think, to answer. Because of how the farm programs are constructed right now, there are a lot of disincentives to grow fruits and vegetables. And so that's part of the Farm Bill, we would say, policy reform that needs to take place. And so there are not the sort of protective policies to protect farmers who grow fruits and vegetables, and then the uncertain supply, as Patty pointed out in her presentation. If you're growing the commodity crops, you have a clear market, and it's there for you, and you're protected if the market drops in some way. So this is our challenge. I mean, I think to be able to increase production domestically, and particularly for local markets. You know, the USDA, I think, just came out with a study earlier this week that pointed out that the local foods market is now up to something like $4.8 billion, way more than they had thought. So there is this consumer demand there to purchase more locally, and primarily that means fresher and primarily a lot of fruits and vegetables and locally produced meats and so forth. We haven't, the policy parts have not caught up with sort of what people want, and that is really our challenge.
Yeah, this is Patty. I can just add a little bit to that. It is a big question. I think that's about 3 questions in one, but they're the right questions we need to be asking. And to go even bigger picture, we struggle a little bit with this too, because, and I've talked to plenty of fruit and vegetable producers who don't want to be in a program like corn and soy. They don't want to be driven to always have the cheapest produce possible, and they're pretty quick to kind of offer the cautionary statement of, like, just be careful what you wish for, because if you wish for really, really cheap fruits and vegetables, you'll get them, but you'll get them from places that might be, countries that don't have the standards that we have, that don't have worker protections or pesticide rules or any number of other things. And so at some point, while we're having this conversation about, people's access to healthy food, we're going to have to help people get that access, and sometimes that includes the nutrition programs that give people more money to go buy what they need. I mean, we have, at this point, we're in several decades now of people's real income not going up, and our food policy is tied into that. There's this constant pressure to provide food cheaply, and we're getting what we pay for in a lot of ways. So rather than the constant pressure to make healthy food cheaper, we also need to tackle the very large, concept of getting people more buying power, and getting people the money they need to buy food that's good for them, and that puts enough money in the system to grow that food the right way. So that's just as big as all of these food topics, but it's really intertwined.
Matthew, follow-up question with a little finer point on this issue. The existing penalties for growing fruits and vegetables in the current laws has not been addressed. What is the common denominator we can stand behind to achieve real change to benefit farmers and health?
Yeah, I was reviewing that question and trying to think of the best way to answer it. I mean, there are so many levels that we need to work together. I don't think there's simply one solution. I think we need to be addressing change at every level of the food system. I think, one of the things that we, as I mentioned earlier, regarding the opportunity looking at SNAP, of course, is, well, firstly, we need to make sure that there isn't, I think, a false assumption that undermines SNAP. I think we need to be protecting the program. But I do think we need to be looking at whether or not there can be some SNAP incentives or support to encourage that, particularly in farmers markets and other venues where you've got such an opportunity, and right now that's being missed by lack of resources like EBT and other equipment issues like that. I think that one thing I think that could also be a rallying point is that we need to look at the consumer end and the grocery industry and the input that, while they can be incredibly important partners in addressing underserved communities and access, we also need to look at the pressures that they apply going back to some of Patty's slides earlier, and the influence they have on the production side. And I think the large supermarkets do have a tremendous influence, and much of it, unfortunately, is negative. And we need to think through how they can be stakeholders at the table and partners in supporting healthier outcomes. So that's the large supermarkets. And I think we're all familiar with those brands. How can they be truly partners at the table and address how they are benefiting currently from the food system and how those benefits, unfortunately, are impacting health outcomes? I think as well for the public health community, something that we feel very strongly about, I want to underscore two critical issues that have not yet been mentioned. First is the marketing of food, particularly to children. I know this is an issue that's complicated in the U.S. because of something, the First Amendment and free speech. However, I think it's a real concern currently in the way in which food is being marketed and the way in which that's impacting people's choices and the demand issues that came up earlier. So we truly do need to have common sense limits on the marketing of unhealthy food and the way in which corporations currently are using their marketing their products. And I know that there is a lot of pressure from industry right now on the administration to undermine the common sense self-regulation, and we need, as a community, health and sustainable agriculture and the farming community need to be one voice on that issue. And then finally, we need to look at policy solutions that like, for example, having a fee or a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages to not just create a revenue, but to also address demand at the consumer end. And I think that's something that needs to have real focus. It's not obviously something that's being discussed in relationship to the Farm Bill, but it's something that we all need to get behind, which is looking at taxes on unhealthy foods or beverages.
So here's one that goes right to the point. What's the summary answer of the panelists to the webinar's title? Patty?
You want to go first? Yeah. Not by themselves. No, not directly.
My answer to the question is that it's for subsidies, no. I think that high fructose corn syrup and the relationship to the food industry clearly is impacting what's impacting people's calorie intake. But the solutions obviously are more complicated.
Yeah, and I would add my 2 cents, which is that we're not really trained within the health professionals to look at these problems as problems of systems. And so we still, confronted by big, meaty issues like the obesity epidemic or the Farm Bill, we tend to look for easy answers and simple answers, but that's not really the way that systems work. So, I think the title, as provocative as it may have been, kind of underscores that tendency to want to look for an easy answer when, as I think all the panelists have said, it's going to take more work at multiple levels beyond just the subsidy title.
Can I say, David, one thing that there have been some really positive feedback I've received and others, and also some constructive criticism about the white paper and the inference or conclusions that should be drawn. And no one is saying that we should not be addressing commodity policy and reform. And in fact, Food and Water Watch and PHI do say strongly that the subsidy system is broken and it does need to be reformed. However, the simple, I think, conclusion that are often reached in the health community is, let's just cut subsidies. And I think, obviously, what you've just said, David, I strongly support, which is that it really is a systems issue. It's more complicated. And we need to look at the common sense reform of the commodity system that will then allow us to support and invest in the types of policy solutions that do create a healthier food environment, a healthier food system at regional, local, and national level.
Thank you. Next question. I just lost. What we see on the ground, this questioner says, is that policy is needed, yes, but the funds and support are not trickling down to the community level. Are there discussions and strategic sessions being had to bridge the resources more directly to local needs? And I know this has been a big topic of discussion in our Healthy Farms, Healthy People Coalition. So I would just say, in short, yes. There have been those discussions and strategic sessions, but not necessarily the funding to carry those to the next step, which is the longer-term changes that trickle down to the community level. Would you have anything to add, Matthew?
No, that's true.
Yeah.
This is Patty. I would just add, we also need, here in Washington, it is all about money now, and it has been for the last year, and it's going to be for several more years. And lots of the cutting that's going on has nothing to do with saving money. It has to do with, people exercising their priorities for what kind of agriculture and food they want to see. And so we also need people on the ground to speak up about programs that do work, or that could be bigger, or that were pilots and need to be expanded, for things like getting people access to use their food stamps at a farmer's market. Like, those are great programs. That's the kind of stuff that's under threat, which is insane. And we need people to step up and say, that's the kind of programs we need in our community. They're valuable.
Hey, we haven't had any questions on this piece, but I'm going to throw my 2 cents in there. And that's about research. And, the Farm Bill has has historically had a research title. And many health professionals are pretty comfortable with the idea of research policy and how that changes the discussion long term. I wonder if any of you have something to say about the intersection between where we're at and research.
Patty, do you want to speak to that in terms of the recommendations in terms of investing in research under the white paper?
Sure. We think that, so the Farm Bill, is divided into chapters. If it was a book, they'd be chapters. In a law, they're called titles. There is a research title historically in Farm Bills, and it's a lot of money. It used to be more. There's more and more corporate money flowing into the schools that do agricultural research, but the USDA still does spend a good bit of money on research into food issues and agriculture issues. And the type of things we would like to see to transition people, to transition farmers away from kind of conventional, chemical intensive, industrialized livestock production, that kind of agriculture. It takes research to do that. People aren't just going to bet their farm literally on trying something new next year. They want to see some data. They want to see that they can do it. And historically, USDA used to help people, make that leap with data, with good practices. But in the last several decades, all of the research coming out of USDA virtually is how to get bigger, how to get more intense, how to, do the wrong kind of moving in the wrong direction. So there's a big push to, devote more of USDA's research agenda to transition, to getting people out of the kind of commodity treadmill into doing something differently, into doing fruits and vegetables, into rotating crops more, all kinds of things. And it's pennies compared to the bigger research budget. So that's one more thing, we can be pushing for when we're talking to policymakers about, I want, the USDA's agenda to be broader than what it has been.
Couple more questions here. This questioner apparently knows quite a bit about the Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program and says, I would recommend that this be part of the policy solution to increase both demand and access to healthy foods. This is a highly successful program which increases consumption of locally grown fruits and vegetables by low-income older adults. Unfortunately, the program is not available in every area. It's not an entitlement program, thus there is always a waiting list.
I would agree. It's a tremendously important program. I think there's other farmers market initiatives. I think that there's an opportunity perhaps to look at strengthening those and maybe being a little more comprehensive so that we don't just have a seniors program. We can look at an overarching program. Unfortunately, in some areas, it's also being underutilized, and some states have had to turn money back or to other states, and so some effort to strengthen that is going to be critical. Farmers market programs generally, it's critical.
And then one last question, and then I think we're going to give the presenters a chance to say some closing thoughts. Is there any effort to try to engage supermarkets as well as farmers markets in collaborating with farmers? Seems like this would extend the reach and encourage farms to grow more variety and nutritional value. Ben, we haven't heard from you in a bit. Do you want to?
Yes, I think that varies a lot around the country. So I can say there's a lot of that going on here in the Midwest. There's a lot of as I pointed out earlier, the growth in the local food market, however you define it, the way the USDA has tallied it up, is something that the industry is paying attention to. And some of the biggest food distributors are paying attention to it, as well as supermarkets of all sizes. And for them, part of the challenge is the infrastructure and figuring out how to, receive things from farmers in different amounts and getting things predictably delivered. So these are really difficult infrastructure challenges, and this is one of the reasons why it's really important that policy supports redeveloping that infrastructure. That's really what we've lost over the last several decades, and in turn put in that infrastructure now that's so centralized and really only handles a few crops.
So I actually lied. I'm going to bring in one more question tonight. It's a good note to end on. In terms of some of the farm policy recommendations that came up, the grain reserves, establishing minimum prices for farmers, a minimum wage, are these in this year's Farm Bill? Are there Congress members who are championing these proposals?
Sorry, David, I missed. There's a lot of feedback from one of the callers. I'm not sure who it is.
Yeah, excuse me. I'll repeat it. In terms of some of the farm policy reforms that were recommended in the report or that came up in terms of grain reserve programs or a minimum wage for farmers, are those in the current Farm Bill? And if so, who are the champions behind them in Congress?
So why don't I start on I know on the ones that relate to nutrition and obesity. So some of the public health priorities. So I don't think we know right now. The truth is that with the secret Farm Bill, and we're expecting maybe to see the language either the end of this week or early next, we really don't yet know what's in there. And we're hoping that the cuts, particularly in the nutrition title, won't be, we were urging none, but we're hoping they're not going to be too significant, that we will protect the integrity of SNAP, that we will see increased support for nutrition programs like the snack program or maybe a small piece for incentives, but at this point we really don't know. Patty, do you want to address the other issues?
Yeah, that's the short-term problem we're in, is that we don't know. But what we do know, historically, is there are organizations, the National Family Farm Coalition, the National Farmers Union, who are pushing for these types of policies and have for a while. But we're up against very powerful interests, including the companies that buy these crops cheaply and the trade associations that really focus on them. And the secret Farm Bill process has been pretty dominated by those powerful players. What we do know is that in the mix of people have sent things into that process. We don't know what's happening in the secret process, but lots of folks have sent in proposals. There is a proposal to create a grain reserve that the National Farmers Union tried to inject into that mix. It doesn't seem to be what's being discussed from the rumors and reports we get. It seems like there's more of the same, that they may come out with this process. They may shift, paying farmers directly, which we don't think deals with these core problems, to crop insurance, which doesn't deal with these core problems. So it's not a great scenario right now for the way that this Farm Bill is being done. But these issues are out there, and people do want to talk about them if we have a process where we're allowed to.
Well, I think we'll end there, and thank you all who are still on the call for staying a few minutes more for questions, which were great. I want to thank the panelists. I know they will all continue to be engaged as this story around the Farm Bill and the subsidy issues continue. I want to just point you to the Local Farms Food and Jobs Act that Ben Lilliston mentioned. This is an example of a piece of legislation that does specifically deal with supply as well as demand for healthy foods, and that Healthy Food Action is asking people to consider supporting through calls to their representatives. If you're interested in more information about the Healthy Farms, Healthy People Coalition, please contact us, and we will steer you to more information about it and the future activities that it is planning on as well.
Can we give the website out, David? It's hfhpcoalition.org, hfhpcoalition.org. Just if people want to go to that website, they can sign up there.
That's right. Thank you, Matthew. And Kendra, did you have anything to finish up on?
Thanks, David. I did just want to mention to people that a recording of this webinar will be made available on the Healthy Food Action website. That's at healthyfoodaction.org. It should be up by next week, so people can check back there if they want to review the recording or the slides. And you can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And I just wanted to echo your thanks for our presenters, and thanks to the audience for joining us today. Until next time, bye-bye.